Welcome to Torah on the Go. Whether you are walking your dog or on the Peloton, taking a break from work, we are so glad that you decided to take a few minutes and learn with me and my partner, Rabbi Feinstein.
Good afternoon.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, however, whatever time it is. We are glad that you are here, and also because this week is the holiday of Thanksgiving.
Amen.
Amen. It's our favorite holiday as rabbis.
I can taste it now.
No Musaf. So in Hebrew, it's called Chag Hodu, or the holiday of gratitude.
Or the holiday of turkey.
The holiday of turkey, exactly. The holiday of turkey. And so first we have to begin as rabbis by talking a little bit about food. What is your favorite dish served at your Thanksgiving dinner?
Oh, spite. Family conflict, argument. Turn off the television and come to the table. That's the main course in our home. So,
do you turn off the TV?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we actually take the dinner somewhat seriously, and we've evolved over the years our own little Passover, Thanksgiving Seder. That's why this just a little bit of a ritual of going around the table and giving thanks and talking about what changed since last year.
Right.
We've created a ritual out of this.
We're conservative Jews, so we don't turn off the TV. We just mute it so that you can see the football if you stand in the doorway and peer around the corner, but it doesn't interrupt the dinner. Yes.
Right. We watch the football outside the house, but not in the house.
Okay, so Thanksgiving, I mean, you just confused Thanksgiving and Passover for good reason. We're talking about the book of Exodus.
Right.
Thanksgiving teaches us our American heritage, our identity, through a story.
Right.
And as Jews, we're also taught who we are as a story. Now, it'd be a totally different Jewish identity if we said to people, you're Jewish because we believe in the Torah. But that's never what we say to people. We sit people around the table around Passover time and say that we're Jews because we underwent this profound transformation from slaves to free people out in the wilderness, seeking our own destiny, and discovering our relationship with God at Mount Sinai, building institutions that celebrate that and that facilitate a sense of community as we move towards a brighter horizon.
Right.
And the American story is
same story.
Almost the same story.
Right.
Almost the same story. What is the power in narrative history?
Well, I just want to let's just take this up because it's so very, very important to recognize. We feel more comfortable in the American diaspora than we have ever felt in any diaspora in all of the years, in the 2,000 years of Jewish diaspora, including the difficulties we're facing since October 7th. And the reason is because the two stories are so congruent. We both, Americans and Jews, tell the story. We started in a place of tyranny. We rebelled against that tyrant. We escaped from there through a harrowing experience, crossed a wilderness or an ocean through a tumultuous, difficult journey, arrived in a land that was given to us by providence, found help in that land, settled in that land, and we gather every year over a ritual meal to give thanks. It's the same story. There's a congruence between the two stories. And one scholar, Lebovitz, once pointed out it's a darn good thing they chose a turkey. Because if they'd chosen a ham, it'd be a very different story.
Very different.
Right? But the most important part of the story of Thanksgiving that makes it our story is they call themselves pilgrims. Now, what is a pilgrim? A person can come from one place to another under very different circumstances. You could be a tourist. You could be a visitor. You could be a refugee. You could be an alien. You could be all sorts of different guises we call ourselves. But a pilgrim recognizes that they're going from a place of lesser sanctity to a place of greater sanctity, closer to God, closer to providence. And that both the Jewish story and the American story carry this sacred tone, this sacred tenor, that this wasn't just an accident, that this was somehow willed, that this is somehow aided by a providential God. And that gives the whole American experience a certain sanctity. It gives our Jewish experience a very definite sanctity. And that's what brings the two stories so wonderfully close together. That plus a ritual meal. I mean, there could have been a lot of ways to celebrate this holiday, but the idea of sitting down at a meal with ritual foods, with prescribed ritual foods. In our one case, it's matzah and maror and charoset, and in this case, it's turkey and stuffing and cornbread. And don't make fun of that. That's actually a very powerful thing that unites us, because no matter where you come from in the world, if you came from, as my ancestors, your ancestors came from Eastern Europe or Central Europe, my neighbor's ancestors came from Tehran, my other neighbor's ancestors came from elsewhere. We all sit down to the same meal and we tell the story in the first person. My ancestors, because of Ba'avur zeh sha'asa li Adonai b'tzeti Mitzrayim, because of what God did for me when I came out of Egypt, and my ancestors came to Plymouth in 1620 and settled this great land. That's the power of narrative that identifies us no matter where we come from. That makes us a national community.
And I would argue that the Torah begins this sense of narrative identity sharing, teaching, narrative storytelling, narrative history telling. The Torah begins not by explaining the laws to us, but by telling us a story about our ancestors. Mm-hmm. The laws are embedded within that story. We don't sit down at the table at Thanksgiving and say, we are Americans because we believe in the Constitution.
Yes.
We could say that, but that's not who we are.
Yeah.
That's not. We're pilgrims. Now, it's fascinating because even in modern Jewish life, if a person were to move from diaspora to Israel, we use a word called aliyah. That person has moved up, right? It's not just that they've moved or immigrated. At the Z3 conference, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was introduced, and the moderator said, and your parents immigrated to Israel in the year, and he says, I have to correct you. My parents did not immigrate to Israel. They made aliyah. They went up. It's very similar to the idea of pilgrims. Mm-hmm. They weren't refugees. That's not the word that we use to describe them.
Right.
And in naming that, we assign a certain kind of exceptionalism to these places.
Yes.
That these places are exceptional in some way that is beyond human description.
Yeah, it's not just we ran away from.
Right.
We ran away toward. We went towards something that we saw was of greater value and deeper sanctity. That's exactly right.
Right. Now the Exodus story begins with Moses. Mm-hmm. And if you really pay attention to the Haggadah at Passover time, you have the Moses narrative, and then you have the rabbis who lived 1,500 years later, let's say at least 1,500 years later.
Right.
In the American story is so truncated as compared, right? We're talking about 400 years ago as opposed to today.
Yeah.
In the Pilgrims, I always find it amazing that we know the name of the Mayflower, we know lots of Plymouth Rock. We don't know the names of the people in our portrait. All of us have a mental image of what it looked like.
Right, with the costumes, yeah.
That's right, with the costumes, exactly.
Right.
The pilgrims sitting down with the natives. All of us learned this in school growing up.
Right.
But we don't know the names, and it allows those faceless names allow us to enter the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because all of us are pilgrims, essentially.
Yeah.
That's what the American dream holds out.
Yeah.
Is that our ancestors did the same thing. They came here seeking a better future.
And it carries some interesting sort of corollaries. I mean, one of the corollaries is we ran away from tyranny toward a place of freedom, which means that they're built into the American experience, there's an inbred suspicion of authority. It's why every presidential candidate, every candidate for higher office in any form runs against the government, runs against the incumbent. Right? Even if the person is the incumbent, they run against the incumbent because this idea of anyone who really wants to be in authority, we suspect that person. They immediately become either Pharaoh, right, or the king of England who persecuted these poor people. Right? So that's one of the corollaries. But the very deepest corollary is what you said, is this wonderful idea that this is a sacred journey guided by providence. That this is beshert. That's a good Thanksgiving word, right? That this is beshert, that there's something destined to happen here, that we were destined to come. Now, of course, there's a huge problem with the story, in both stories, by the way, but let's stick to the American one for a moment, which is the natives came and helped them survive the first winter. And then they sat down and had a feast of Thanksgiving with the natives to thank them for their aid. And then, they slaughtered the natives and stole the continent from them. And that's a stain on the story. That's a stain on the story that we are living now through, trying to undo that kind of thing by recognizing the diversity of populations that have come to this continent with us and embracing this diversity as one large national community. So there's a revisionist history that tries to erase the Thanksgiving story, which I think would be a terrible idea because I still think it has such beautiful value. But the idea of embracing a diversity, look around the table and see all the different nationalities and cultures and faiths and languages that have come to settle America, right? Plus the indigenous people who have been here to settle America. And let's embrace them and make them part of the rich symphony that is this continent.
When people say to me that they think that the story that they learned as a child is false,
yeah,
I always smile and nod, of course, because I understand what they're saying. They're talking about that we weren't taught about the indigenous population. We weren't taught about the natives. First of all, growing up in Chicago, we learned a ton about the natives. That's what we learned, right? We didn't have the missions to learn about in Chicago. You learn all about the natives of the plains. And in addition, I always smile because if you learned all of American history in 3rd and 4th grade, what did these students think that they were going to learn in high school and college and get PhDs in American history? What would be left for them to dig deeper? We, of course, have to begin with a kind of simple or oversimplified story of history to teach to children, and then we continue to dig deeper and add layers. Right. And that's how all of us grow up. I mean, how many times do we sit with people in synagogue who are accomplished in whatever professional field they are? They're an expert. And in terms of their Jewish learning, they're still 13.
Yeah.
They're still 13 because the moment that they left religious school is the last moment that they ever sat in a classroom and thought about Judaism.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, they have this incredible discrepancy between the understanding that they have of medicine or law or business and the understanding that they have of the Torah.
Of faith,
because they've stopped pursuing it in this way. And in that way, I think that the hope of Judaism and the hope of America is actually also the same, and that is education. Mm-hmm. That's actually learning and engaging in the study of our story. And I think that's also the challenge in 2024 is who is the teacher, what is the education, and how does that story get told, and informs how our kids and how we ourselves understand this country, this great country in this moment.
Yeah. I respect the revisionist for wanting to include the parts that have been suppressed. But
absolutely.
But I don't think you have to erase the entire history of a culture because it isn't morally pure. The moral impurity, as we learn from the Torah, I mean, there's nobody pure in the Torah, right? Or in the Bible, right? The moral purity is not something you find in human circles, especially as people make huge decisions about cultures and about countries and about nations. But you can still embrace heroes, right? And I still think that the Thanksgiving story has tremendous value because this idea that there's something destined about this place. There's something, look, this idea of an America made up of multiple cultures, of liberal democracy, liberal in the old sense, the classical sense, not the political sense, an open liberal democracy which unites many, many, many cultures around the table to share a democracy, to create a common culture out of the diversity that sits at our table. This had never been tried in human history. And frankly, it don't work in many other places around the world. It's really a fraught experiment. And yet, we've carried it off now for 200 and something years. And I think that it's so remarkable that we can celebrate it and celebrate our place in it. We came to this continent. Some of us came in the middle of the 19th century. Many of us came at the beginning of the 20th century. Some in the middle of the 20th century. We Jews came to this continent. We came to this culture and found freedom, found security, found a place. You have to say thank you for this. You have to see how remarkable and miraculous this is.
I note in my upcoming book, this is the first place in the diaspora where Jewish citizenship was never a question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jews were a part of this experiment from the very beginning.
Yes.
Chaim Solomon, the financier of the American Revolution.
Right.
These are people who are embedded in the American narrative. Jews every generation can point and say, we were there at this stage of the development of this country.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, I agree with you. We have to absolutely give thanks because this country has always been warm and welcoming, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. We've had chapters that are more complicated in this country. We might be going through one right now as we speak.
Yeah.
In spite of all of that, we have to still give thanks. This is the most welcoming diaspora experience we've ever had in the Jewish history.
I think that one of the things we need, and we're in a position to recommend this to our friends, the Thanksgiving table needs a Haggadah. It needs a script. Every family has their own way of doing it. Turn off the television, come to the table. We go around the table, give thanks. But I really think we need to write a script for this. And what I would really recommend, I'm a big believer in the founding documents of this democracy. One of the ones that I'll recommend to those watching, those listening is in 1789, when George Washington is elected the first president of this country, it had been a custom in Europe that when a new king was crowned, the Jewish congregations, Jewish communities would write that king a letter of loyalty.
It's amazing, yeah.
And ask for loyalty. So the first great Jewish community on this continent was in Newport, Rhode Island. They write a letter. It's actually a big controversy because there were three letters.
The Torah synagogue.
Yeah, the Torah synagogue. They write a letter to Washington in the language of that European a loyalty letter, asking him for tolerance. And he writes back a letter. Google this. George Washington's letter to the Newport congregation, 1790. It is astonishing. George Washington, the first president, the guy who won the revolution, 6'4" Virginian planter, writes back to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island and says, you don't have to ask me for tolerance. You're a citizen and I'm a citizen. You belong here like I belong here. You don't have to ask any of your neighbors for tolerance. You are an equal member of this democracy. It'll make you cry.
And within it, he writes quotes from Scripture.
Absolutely.
Right? May we each find our peace and security under our own olive tree. I mean, it's beautiful how he does it.
Beautiful document that describes what, and your book does this beautifully, by the way, so I recommend the Rabbi's book. This sense of our belonging here. And especially since October 7th, especially with the stuff we see around us, in order to truly appreciate how much of an aberration anti-Semitism is in this continent, you've got to read documents like that one, where the greatest American in that generation, well, between him and Jefferson, the greatest American says to us, you belong here, just like I belong here. We are all equal members of this democracy. That is such a wonderful thing to read at the table and remind our children and their children how precious this freedom is.
And I would argue that Washington, were we to create this Haggadah, Washington would very much be the Moses figure.
Right.
And the brilliance of Washington, we don't know where Moses is buried because we're not supposed to worship at Moses' burial site. Just imagine this for a minute, that at the end of the Passover Haggadah, we say, and that's why we're all traveling to the Sinai Peninsula next year to make our annual pilgrimage to Moses' burial site for offering gratitude for him taking us out of Egypt. At the very end of Washington's term as president, I don't think that anybody would have blamed him if he had said, I'm actually going to serve till the day I die.
Yeah,
I'm actually going to stay in charge. And that's why his farewell address is one of the profound documents that warns us of the dangers that this country will face.
Yes.
And it's as true today as it was the day that he removed himself from office. And the idea that he needed to practice some sort of minimalization, that he recognized that the way that this experiment would work is only if he stepped down and trusted in one of the other people who signed the founding documents to step into the role of president. That's the only way we would not develop a monarchy.
Right.
And it's fascinating because I think those two characters of Moses and Washington, they both are flawed. they're both not without criticism.
Sure.
And they're both so crucial to who we are as a people.
Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address.
Amazing.
Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. There's a synagogue in Chicago.
Kennedy's inaugural address. There's a synagogue in Chicago, Anshe Emet, the great conservative synagogue downtown. Solomon Goldman, great rabbi 50 years ago, built it. And in the stained glass window that's above the sanctuary, on one side is Isaiah and Jeremiah, and on the other side is Washington and Lincoln. Because Goldman was a big patriot, and he believed that this was a sacred place, and these were sacred personalities to be admired and to be. And it's interesting that here you have two rabbis. We're talking about how critical Jewish life and we're talking about America here, because and it's interesting that we are, because no one's doing that, because somehow we have lost this level of patriotism. It got swallowed up in the explosion of politics in this country. It got swallowed up in the polarity. And so what we're asking you to do is to go back to the beginning, like the Haggadah, and remind ourselves what the great narrative of this land is. And so my last question to you about this perspective Haggadah that VBS might put out is, in the Exodus narrative that we study, Pharaoh is kind of a sinister, wicked figure, faceless, nameless, evil.
Right.
And in the American portrayal of King George, he's kind of this thoughtless buffoon.
He's a fool.
He's more like a Chashverosh.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating to me is that this country's rebellion against that, that feeds into the idea that humankind has the ability to reject that notion of kingship. Mm-hmm. In the same way that in the story of Esther, God is not present. In the American Revolution, they don't invoke God to bring plagues unto King George. Mm-hmm. What do you think that means in the idea that the Jewish narrative is this narrative we rebel against, we set out, we're redeemed from slavery from the wicked? And here in the United States, America is born with this kind of throwing off of the shackles of foolishness, of overbearing foolishness.
Yeah, I think that our ancestors in this land wanted a new beginning. They really wanted to begin again. They really recognized that American life was very different than the old country. Again, in our Haggadah, Emma Lazarus's poem on the base of the Statue of Liberty, "Give me your tired, your
Beautiful.
poor, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores." The idea that America starts with this idea of equality. There's no aristocracy, there's no monarchy. We are just all citizens. We all equally belong. We're all here to protect each other's rights. We all accept the responsibilities of this land. There's no aristocracy. Americans really love to watch Downton Abbey because we like to see, sort of fell at the oldest aristocracy, but we wouldn't want to live there, right? The idea of equality, the idea that we all belong and there's an equality among citizens in this land. And they had to push away. They weren't just pushing away the military force, the mighty military force of the British Empire. They were pushing away an entire way of life of Europe and trying to start something radically new. Human beings recognize in each other equal dignity. No classes, no formal castes. I mean, that happens, of course, in our culture, and there's a big argument, of course, and it happens how racism and other kinds of things. But the ideal of equality, that's what they were reaching for.
And I guess my last quote would be, I think I'd include some Hamilton in my Haggadah. Maybe the world was wide enough for Hamilton and me, all right? So if there's anything that teaches American history, I feel like to my kids, it's certainly the Hamilton musical. If you haven't seen it, please see it. I want to wish you, from my family to yours, a happy Thanksgiving.
A happy Thanksgiving, and let's give thanks for all that we've had.
Chag Sameach.